Hello there and good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where and when you are. I'm Christy and I am back from my field research into the UK general election. Now that I'm back and settled in, I've turned my attention to a request. People really enjoyed the This Week in Stupid Misogynist episode that I put up about 2 months ago. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to do any more because I've been a little too busy. But while I was away, I gathered up stories pertaining to misogyny and sexism. Over the course of 6 weeks, I managed to collect about 30. So I have several episodes of This Week in Stupid Misogynist planned for your edification, for your perhaps slight entertainment. Also, these are not going to be in chronological order. I've done them rather in a thematic order so that they kind of group together a little bit more. That being said, let's get on with this week's episode of This Week in Stupid Misogynists. Our first piece is actually a blog piece, not a news article. It's written by a male blogger, and he is trying to answer the question, why skeptics fall for misogynist ideology. He writes, given the critical role religion has played in entrenching misogyny and racism, you'd hope that when people break free of religion, they would abandon those prejudices as well. Sadly, the truth is that many people just invent new ways to rationalize their bigotry and carry on acting as before, instead of their deconversion prompting a complete reevaluation of the beliefs that form their self. They wrongly conclude that because they've seen through one false belief, they now know everything and don't need to look any deeper, something that's implicit in their red pill self-designation. For red pillars, one common rationalization comes from evolutionary psychology, the belief that men are genetically compelled to be promiscuous or even violent, and it's wrong for society to suppress these natural urges. Like scientific racism before it, this amounts to little more than a pseudoscientific sheen painted atop a mountain of unexamined prejudice. It's a stain on the secular community that we haven't been more resistant to misogyny like this. I maintain that atheists are less sexist than organized religion, but I admit that's not saying much. This is a theme that I've gone on about quite often as well, that when people look at a Bronze Age book and they say, this is silly, this doesn't tell us anything about how the universe came into being, it doesn't tell us anything about our meaning in that place in the universe. That's fine, but the next step is, where are all the points in our society where this Bronze Age book still has an influence? And certainly with patriarchal power structures, where being a man is valued far more than being a woman, or men are seen as holding power more naturally or holding certain status positions more naturally than women, that view of things as being natural and right is actually a reflection of the biblical patriarchy that our culture has been seeped in for thousands of years. I would argue, in fact, that our atheism requires a more radical approach of unpacking all of the societal beliefs and values that have come with this monotheistic tradition. And that's what the author is arguing for as well. It's not enough to just go, you know what, I don't think God exists. What it requires is you to unpack and question every assumption based on the assertion that God exists. Well, why do men have more power? Well, because that's the way God wanted it. Not good enough. Not good enough. Researchers have found an association between men who make sexist jokes and men who express insecurity about their masculinity. Researchers from Western Carolina University in the US conducted 2 experiments with 387 heterosexual men. They found that disparaging jokes are often used to reinforce one's position as part of an in-group by clearly separating them from an out-group. And it's men who use the sexist and anti-gay humor who often do this to reaffirm their own sense of self, particularly when they feel their masculinity is being threatened. I think we can all say that we see constant use of anti-gay rhetoric and sexist rhetoric directed at people on YouTube, but this, of course, is also part of people's lived experiences, being targeted by some men who feel insecure about their masculinity. And just like of children on a playground for a bully who wants to feel a sense of status and displaying dominance is considered to have social status. And as you'll see, this isn't the only study that links low or threatened masculinity with sexist or phobic behaviors. This study looks at what happens to men who earn less than their wives. Dan Cassino, a political scientist at Fairleigh Dickinson University, tracked the social views of individual men over time and published his findings at the Harvard Business Review. His study showed that men who reported being worried about earning less than their wives or live-in partners reduced their support for Hillary Clinton, but it didn't affect their support for Bernie Sanders. Now, why would that be? The author writes, "If you guessed because Bernie is a dude, you'd likely be right." Cassino found that when men were primed to consider earning less than women, they felt less excited about a female president, presumably because their masculinity felt threatened. Cassino writes, "Being the breadwinner has been a linchpin of U.S. masculinity for decades, so even the potential of making less than one spouse threatens accepted gender roles." The final bit I want to read from this goes as follows. "Researchers have long known that ideas about masculinity impact how men behave. One study showed that when their masculinity is threatened, men are more likely to buy an SUV and assert themselves as household decision makers. Sociologists call this overcompensation. When you aren't feeling masculine, you want to do things that show you're manly." Another report showed that when men feel threatened as men, they are more likely to sexually harass women in the workplace, but not just any women, high-ranking women. If you do an examination of literature into masculinity and the types of behaviors associated with insecure masculinity versus secure masculinity, you start to see this pattern emerging very clearly over studies, which is in a culture where masculinity teaches that men are supposed to be dominant and breadwinners and in control. Anything that threatens that, for some men, not all men, hashtag not all men, for some men, the way that they will react to this perceived slight is to tell sexist jokes, tell homophobic jokes to try to reassign themselves to the in-group status, right? Elevate their status. Or in this case, harass women in the workplace who have more power than them in order to bring those women down below to their level and below them. And these behaviors result in conflict. So what we really need is not to just tell women to put up with harassment in the workplace, or for anyone to put up with harassment in the workplace, and instead question the whole notion of masculinity as being defined by control, silence, outbursts of violence in order to resolve problems, the typical things that undermine human relationships, really. These attitudes in a culture end up, as I say, hurting people. And one example of this was demonstrated recently as a woman performer on Italian television was pranked in the form of a sexual assault. While performing on television, a former Eurovision contestant, Emma Marone, was seen repeatedly telling a man who was dancing on her, next to her, grinding up against her, to stop touching her. After the clip was broadcast, campaigners launched a petition to introduce new guidelines for the media on dealing with sexual violence, and at the time this article was published, it had more than 10,000 signatures. The producers of the show called it a prank, despite the fact that Miss Marone was obviously uncomfortable with the man's behavior as he attempted to press up against her, kiss her, touch her hair, legs, buttocks, and breasts. Media organizations have tried to minimize the incident, suggesting the singer was overreacting or describing the show as hilarious. But women's rights organization Non Uno de Meno tweeted, "Sexual violence is never something to laugh at." The idea that sexually assaulting a woman while she's trying to be a professional and do her job is somehow entertaining is kind of the whole problem here. The idea is to, of course, reduce her to her sexuality, to show someone taking advantage of her, to show her being humiliated. That's exactly the kind of toxic masculinity that the previous two studies were alluding to. We can see how this all ties together. The attitudes end up producing behaviors, the behaviors get reactions, and then the reactions to those behaviors either reinforce or undermine the dominant paradigm of what masculinity is. And the way to change that is to change that. Our last story looks at how much it sucks to be a little girl who is subjected to sort of masculine perspectives of female sexuality. A 12-year-old girl in Malaysia was asked to change out of her striped dress because it was deemed too seductive for the tournament. According to this report in a Facebook post, a chief arbiter of the competition told the student the dress she was wearing violated the tournament's dress code. He added the dress was seductive and a temptation from a certain angle far, far away. Although the girl was given a reprieve and told if she could wear a different outfit, she would be able to join the next day, her mother spoke to The Star, which is a Malaysian tabloid, saying that she had tried to explain to the chief arbiter she had only brought 3 dresses of similar length for the 3-day event, and the fact that she had tights on, so nothing was revealed. She said, "I tried to reason, but because it was too late, the girl was unable to participate." The idea that a 12-year-old girl put on a dress in order to be seductive and to be a temptation from a certain angle shows me more about the mentality of the arbiter than the girl. This is really about adults imputing sexuality onto children, and in this case, the responsibility for preventing sexual thoughts, again, does not fall upon the boys who are going to have to deal with sexual thoughts their whole life. The blame falls on the girl, and the onus is upon her to cover her body in order to not be a temptation to men. Again, I just find this onus of putting the guilt of men's sexual thoughts onto women from the age of 12? To be a reason why our society gets a little bit messed up. We should really just let kids be kids, you know? Alright guys, that is going to be it from me. I'm trying to keep these episodes shorter, pithier, with just a summary of the news story and some of my thoughts on them. If you like this new format, please go ahead and let me know in the comments. If you have suggestions, like you would like to hear more from me on the opinion side of it, even if it adds a bit of time to the episode, go ahead and let me know too. All that's left to be said at this point is that I've been Christy. You've been awesome. Thank you so much for your time and attention visiting me here on this new series. And we will see each other again very soon. Bye-bye.